Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Robinson, and this week we're going to be talking about vague pronouns. Now, before we can really get into this topic, I want to answer the question, what does the word vague mean? Some of you may know it and some of you may not, so I just want to go ahead and get a definition out there. Vague is just an adjective that means not clearly expressed, not having a precise meaning, not clearly defined or understood, or not clearly felt or sensed. And if you're not picking up the meaning here, 3 out of 4 of those definitions basically say not clear. So vague is just another way of saying unclear, not clear. It's something that is not really specifically defined. So, with that being said, we want to talk about some vague pronouns that can crop up. These are things that may show up in your writing that give you trouble or cause your writing to be unclear. And the number one mistake that we see people make in standard formal written English is overusing or incorrectly using the pronoun you. Now, you isn't a bad word, but people often use the word you when they mean to refer to themselves. So if you listen to this example sentence, you're probably not going to hear anything wrong. And that example is here. It says, Henry was so excited, you could hear it in his voice. Now, I bet that you've probably said a sentence like that to friends, family, maybe even in class. I know that I've said it in class and I'm the teacher, and I probably don't hear anything wrong with that informally. But technically speaking, when you're not referring directly to the listener, you should use a more specific noun or pronoun instead of the word you. In the case of our example there, if Henry and I were the ones having a conversation and you weren't there, then I can't say that you could hear it in his voice because, well, you weren't around. So the correct way to say that with a clear pronoun would be Henry was so excited, I could hear it in his voice. Again, it doesn't seem like a very large distinction, but in standard formal written English, it is something that is going to be nitpicked. And there are some more examples here of ways that you can correct this misuse of the pronoun you. For example, when Dave worked at the zoo, you could smell him a mile away. If you're not being referred to directly, then a better way to state that would be when Dave worked at the zoo, the guests could smell him a mile away. Another example, after staying up all night, I realized that you really need sleep. And this is a person who's probably referring to just somebody generally speaking. So, because they were the ones who stayed up all night, what they should do is phrase it as, after staying up all night, I realized that I really need sleep. And then finally, Ricky and I drove around the block and you couldn't park anywhere. Well, if Ricky and I were the ones driving around the block, we don't need to be talking about what you couldn't or couldn't do. So the correct way to phrase that would be Ricky and I drove around the block and we couldn't park anywhere because they were the only ones in the car. Now, there's some other issues with the word you, and I'm not saying that you can never use it. As a matter of fact, you should use you when you're talking directly to the reader or the listener. For example, in the sentence, the parade is about to start, so you should get the float ready. We're using the word you there to give a command. Hey, you, go get the float ready. That's not a problem. That's an easy one. And there's also a very rare usage of a pronoun one, and this is not one the number, but we use one when we're talking about situations that are very, very broad or hypothetical. And the word hypothetical just means that it's possible, but they haven't really happened. Another way to think about the word one as a pronoun is that you're just referring to someone in the general sense. So this example says, during the safety speech, Lori advised that one should never go hiking alone. You could almost replace the word one there with someone or a person. So another way to say it would be, during the safety speech, Lori advised that a person should never go hiking alone. One is just a fancy way of saying a person or someone. If you get confused, you can always refer to your notes or ask me. Now, when you're not referring directly to the listener, though, remember, you need to use a more specific noun or pronoun instead of you. And these are the same examples as on the previous slide. So, now that we've talked about the most common error with you, let's talk about how we can identify possible antecedents. Remember that an antecedent is just the noun that is being replaced in a sentence because the word antecedent means to come before. So let's take a look at this. If it's unclear in a sentence which noun a pronoun is referring to, then that pronoun is vague. Remember, vague means that it's unclear. So let's look at this first example sentence. It says, when Dave ran into Chris, he was carrying a pie. Now, if you can read that sentence and tell me which one of them was carrying the pie, you're a little bit better than I am. I think I would have to see that visually in order to be able to tell you. Well, when we can't tell by what we're reading, that means we have a vague pronoun because we don't know what he is referring to. We don't know if it's Dave or Chris, so we don't really have a good image of who was doing what. So let's take a look at the next example where we have fixed the pronoun usage. It says, when Dave ran into Amanda, he was carrying a pie. So in this case, Amanda is a female and Dave is a male. So we know by using the word he that we're referring to Dave. So here are some more examples of clear and vague pronouns. I saw the mechanic and the pilot in the park. I gave her a cupcake. That one is vague because when we say her, we don't know if we're referring to the mechanic or the pilot. They could both be women. So it's unclear and we need to fix that. Next sentence says, Dave put a pen in his backpack, but now he can't find it. While when I'm reading this, I probably think Dave's having trouble finding the pen because backpacks nowadays have about 1 billion pockets. It's still likely that Dave just doesn't know where his backpack is. So even though I kind of have a good guess, it's still not clear. Now let's take a look at this last sentence for a good example. Danielle was carrying a pink balloon when she ran into Michelle. So in this case, we know the word she is referring to Danielle because Danielle is mentioned. We know what she's doing, carrying a pink balloon, and then she runs into our next person we meet. So because of the order and structure of the sentence, that's clear. Another possible issue you may run into is when we're using the pronouns it or that. So again, we have some issues with sentences being vague based on how they're phrased. For example, I slipped on a banana during the horror movie. That was scary. In this case, we don't know when we're saying that if we're referring to slipping on a banana or the horror movie itself. Now, what you might use to help you remember that this is unclear is when you say, I slipped on a banana during the horror movie, that was scary. Somebody immediately afterwards could say, what, slipping on a banana or the horror movie? They could ask you that question. So if that's a question they could ask based on your sentence, then your pronoun usage is probably unclear. Your writing, remember, the only reason we're talking about this is going to sound more interesting, more sophisticated. It's going to grip your reader if you're not repeating yourself. And the whole reason we use pronouns is so we don't use somebody's name over and over and over again. But there are also ways that we can use pronouns and word choice to vary our sentences and make things more interesting. So let's take a look at the evolution of this sentence down below. Sue told a joke and breakdanced. It was amazing. In this case, we don't know if it is referring to the joke or her dance, so that makes it vague. So in the next draft of this sentence, this is fixed. Sue told a joke and breakdanced. Her dancing was amazing. Well, we don't have an unclear pronoun. We know we're referring to the dance, but we said danced, and then right afterward we said dancing. So that's the same thing as saying someone's name over and over because we don't want to use a pronoun. So it's not vague, but it is repetitive. Let's look at the final draft of this sentence. Sue told a joke and breakdanced. Her moves were amazing. In this case, we're not reusing the word dance and we don't have an unclear pronoun, so this sentence is easily understandable. This also probably means that her dancing better than her jokes. I feel bad for Sue. Lastly, when we're talking about possible antecedents, here's another thing that I see issue with all the time in students writing is they or them being misused. Okay. And remember that they and them aren't always plural. because some individuals do go by they or them instead of he or she, and some style guides like APA or MLA now accept they and them with singular words like anyone. Always ask your teacher if you aren't sure which pronouns to use in your writing. With that said, we have to keep the idea that if we don't know who is being referred to by a pronoun, that means our pronoun is vague. We have an issue somewhere. So let's take a look. It says the kids and Kate went to the movies. They got popcorn. Now, this is a really interesting situation because when we see they got popcorn, we don't know if that's referring to the kids because that's more than one, or if it's referring to the kids and Kate because that's two separate nouns. So in this case, while I hope everybody got popcorn because we all know movie popcorn is awesome, the way this sentence is written, we don't know who got what. So in the next example, this pronoun is going to be clear because the word she could only refer to Kate. The kids and Kate went to the movies and she got popcorn. So in this case, because we're using a singular pronoun, that could only refer to Kate, not Kate and the kids, and not kids by themselves. So here's some more examples of clearing things up with clear and vague pronouns. I saw the doctors and the pilots in the park, and I gave them a cupcake. We don't know who them is. Is it the doctors? Is it the pilots? Is it both groups? Because we don't know, that's unclear or vague. Here's the same sentence from before. Dave put a pen in his backpack, but now he can't find it. Dave's still looking for that pen or his backpack. Because we don't know what he's looking for, we can't help him find it, so that's a vague sentence. And then here's the same thing, only rephrased with different names. Daniel was carrying a pink balloon when he ran into Michael. So again, because we see Daniel first, we see what he's doing, and then we get the pronoun. Then after the pronoun, we're introduced to the second person in the sentence. Because we have a logical order to what's going on, that makes it clear that he refers to Daniel. So now that we've gotten through that, this is our last section. You're almost there. Unclear antecedents. What do we do when we have no idea who is being referred to, what's going on? This is kind of the trickiest part of unclear pronoun antecedent connection, or sometimes even non-existent pronoun antecedent connection. Remember, pronouns have to refer to an exact noun, and that noun that it refers to is an antecedent. There has to be a 100% match between the pronoun and the antecedent it refers to. Now, you've probably already looked at these example sentences while I've been talking, and you see the one that doesn't match. Let's talk about this one in the middle first. When he was 10, Dave's novel won a prize. You probably don't see an issue with that. You're like, yeah, Dave was the one who won a prize. But remember, we're talking about those particular rules of standard formal written English. So when we say Dave's with an apostrophe S, that turns his name from a noun into a possessive adjective. You don't need to know what a possessive adjective is. All you need to know is if it turns it into not a noun, a pronoun can't refer to it. In this case, Dave is possessing the novel. So we've got all kinds of issues here that maybe to our ear don't sound that bad, but there are other ways to write it. On the top, it says when he was 10, Dave won a prize for his novel. In this case, it's very, very clear that he is referring to Dave. Another way you could rephrase this sentence is when Dave was 10, his novel won a prize. In this case, when I say whose novel, you know you can answer with Dave. So again, it seems like a really nitpicky thing, but that little apostrophe S will give you all kinds of fits with standard grammatical rules. So make sure you're sticking with it. Here's one way that you can try to avoid vague pronouns. Sometimes you've got a really, really, really good sentence and it's difficult to understand what's going on. Remember our friend Sue and her joke and her breakdancing. Sometimes you just have to rephrase. Sometimes you can't use a pronoun where you want to. Sometimes you have to come up with an unrepeated noun. So this is why we talked about Sue earlier. Remember, we went from it, because it was unclear, to her dancing, which was clearer but repetitive and not very good. Then we changed that to her moves. We kind of went through the levels of unclear, boring, and then unique and clear. So if you get in a spot where you're really having trouble understanding what's going on, make sure you try to revise and revise again to get to the clearest possible sentence you can. Here's another way you can take a look at this. If it's unclear, if you cannot figure it out which noun or pronoun is referring to, the pronoun is vague, which means you're not going to know what the author is talking about. So, for example, Dave played hockey and ran 10 miles. That was tiring. We don't know which one was more tiring, playing hockey or running 10 miles, because that could refer to two things. And so here are some more examples that you can use to determine between an incorrect and correct usage. This would be a good time to pause the video and take a screenshot so you'll have this chart for later. Moving on, we want to talk about practice time. So far, we have defined the term vague as unclear. We have reviewed pronouns and antecedents. We have explored how to determine what possible antecedents might exist in a sentence. And we have discovered what to do to correct a situation with unclear antecedents or unclear references. So now it's practice time. You can go show what you know in No Red Ink or however you're practicing with vague pronouns this week. If you have any questions, be sure to review the slides, rewatch the video, or always reach out to your teacher.